Let's now find the difference here. So difference is, of course, subtraction. And for difference, we want to make sure we're doing it in the order they gave us because order matters for subtraction. So we're going to do f of x minus g of x. So our new function h of x is going to be equal to, oops, I'm already doing the opposite of what I just said. So h of x is equal to f of x minus g of x, which is going to be 2x to the 1/2 power minus negative 6x to the 1/2 power. So when we have minus a negative like that, that always turns into plus 6x to the 1/2. And again, we have like terms here, x to the 1/2 and x to the 1/2, so we can combine those. 2 plus 6 is 8, so we have 8x to the 1/2, and that's our new function h of x that we found by finding the difference. Let's move on. We're going to find the quotient and the product of the following functions. Let's start with quotient. And as we know, quotient means division. And for division, order matters. So I'm going to do it in the order they gave us. So f of x was first, g of x was second. So we're going to do f of x divided by g of x. So this is equal to 3x over x to the 1/4. So now we need to do our exponent rules again. So we have 3, and then we have x to the first over x to the 1/4. So that's going to be subtraction in the exponent. So x to the first, so it's going to be x to the 1 minus 1/4 power. So in order to figure that out, we're going to need a common denominator between these two numbers. So I'm going to write 1 as 4 over 4, then minus 1 over 4. That's going to be 3x to the 3/4 power. And that is our new function, h of x, that we found by the quotient. So now let's do the product. So product, as we know, means multiplication. So we're going to find our new function h of x by multiplying f of x times g of x. So that's going to be equal to 3x times x to the 1/4. So for this, we're going to need exponent rules again. So this is multiplication. We have 3. That's just going to hang out by itself in the front because that's the only coefficient. So we have 3 times x to the first times x to the 1/4. So now we're going to add these because it's multiplication. So 1 plus 1/4. And then we have 3x. Once again, I need a common denominator. So I'm going to do the same thing I just did. Rewrite the 1 as 4 over 4. And that's equal to 3x to the 5/4 power. And that's our new function, h of x, that we found by taking the product. So the next thing we will do is something called composition of functions. So composition of functions is basically plugging in one function to another to produce another. So we're substituting in one function for x into another function. So it looks like this. It looks a little funky, but hopefully you'll see what this means. So h of x is equal to, this is called f of g of x. So it's f of g of x. So essentially what you're doing is you're plugging in g of x for x into the function f. And you have to pay attention to the order. These two things are not the same. F of g of x is not the same as g of f of x. So let's come up with kind of a basic example here. So let's say that f of x is equal to, let's say x squared plus 1. And I'm going to say that g of x is equal to 2x. And I want to find f of g of x. So what I'm going to do, let's underline this in red. So g of x, I'm plugging this in g of x, I'm plugging that in for x into this function. So plugging it in for x into that function, and g of x is 2x. So I'm plugging 2x in for x into that function. So here's what it's going to look like. So f of 2x equals 2x squared plus 1. So that's essentially what we're doing. You're taking g of x, plugging it in for x into the function. So that's equal to, now we have to distribute this squared. So it's going to become 4x squared plus 1. And that is f of g of x. So essentially, you're taking one function, plugging it in for x into another function. So we've got some more examples on this page. So in this case, f of x is 3x squared and g of x is 2x minus 1. First, we want to find f of g of x. So f of g of x. So we're going to take g. We're going to take g, so 2x minus 1, and we're going to substitute it in for x. So here's how this is going to go. So we're going to find f of 2x minus 1. So I'm taking my function for g right here, plugging it in for x in the function f. So that's going to become 3. So now this is my function f, 3x squared, but x is being replaced by 2x minus 1. So that's what we did here. We took this function for g and we replaced it for the x in f. So instead of replacing it with a number like we usually do, plugging a number in here, we're replacing it with an entire function. So now this, I'm just going to simplify this. So this is going to be 3 and then 2x minus 1, 2x minus 1. So 3 times, now I'm going to FOIL. So then we have 4x squared minus 2x plus 1. That's just me using FOIL. So first, outer, inner, last. And then 3 times 4x squared. Combine these two guys right here to get minus 4x plus 1. Finally, distribute that 3 to get 12x squared minus 12x plus 3. So that's f of g of x right there. So again, moral of the story here, that was all just simplifying. But the big takeaway here is plugging in one function in for x into another function. So let's do the next example. All right, so the next one we're finding g of f of x. So this time we're taking the function g and we're going to plug in 3x squared for x. So g of f of x is g of f of x, which is 3x squared. So right now all I did was I took what f of x is equal to and I replaced it right here. G of f of x is 3x squared. So g of 3x squared. And now I'm going to take the x in g of x and substitute this in for x. So it's going to be 2 times 3x squared minus 1. So you can see here that I took this x and this x and replaced it with f of x. F of x is 3x squared. So I took the x's in g, replaced it with what f is equal to. And this one's not as much work to simplify. So this, we just have to multiply the 2 and the 3. We get 6x squared minus 1. So that's part B. So let's look at the next one. So for the next one, we're finding f of x, which is a little weird because it's both f's, but that is something we can do. So let's find that. So f of x is going to be f of 3x squared, because f of x, so f of x is f of 3x squared, because that's what f of x is. So now what we need to do is we need to take this x right here and this x right here and replace it with this, replace it with 3x squared. So that's going to become 3. Now we've got the x, so we need to replace it. 3x squared. Now we need to distribute the squared. So 3 times 9x, and this is the power of a power, so it's going to become x to the 4th. So 27x to the 4th. And that, I believe, is it for this section. So just sort of a little intro to power functions and operations. So adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, and then a quick intro to composition of functions.